You got the microphone, I hope, working?
Man, speak loudly. It's not working that well. Say who you are.
Hello, my name is Evan Sankey. I'm an undergraduate here. My question has to do with when you're shrinking the budget deficit, the relative weights that you assign to tax increases and government spending cuts. There was I believe a professor at Harvard named Alberto Alesina who wrote a paper that showed that tax increases harm growth more than spending cuts do. And I'm wondering where you said that there should be a mix, and I'm wondering where you fall in terms of what the precise mix should be. Thank you.
Did you all hear that?
The question was about reducing budget deficits by raising taxes or by cutting expenditures, and what about the research of Greg and my Harvard colleague Alberto Alesina that appears to suggest that you get better results with cutting spending than you do with increasing taxes. I think we're in a very special kind of situation right now because of what economists call the liquidity trap, the fact that we have a zero interest rate. If you study so-called fiscal consolidations, when governments tried to reduce budget deficits in the past, what mostly happens is government reduces the budget deficit, people feel more comfortable about the financial environment, the central bank of the country lowers interest rates and makes credit more widely available, and that offsets the fiscal contraction. And there's evidence that they tend to reduce interest rates more when spending is cut than when taxes are increased. We're in a very different kind of situation now. Professor Alesina hasn't really studied, not because he doesn't want to, but just because there isn't really history to study with zero interest rates on a significant scale. My preference right now in the United States, again, would be to avoid fiscal cutting in the short run until the economy has recovered. I think that the first choice should be any sensible spending cutting that can be identified. But I'm a little skeptical as to how much net spending cutting will succeed in identifying, given the headwinds I mentioned. The headwind of rising interest costs because interest rates are rising. The headwinds that even if we make Medicare much more efficient, many more of us are going to be over 65 or over 70, whatever retirement age you choose, 15 years from now than are today. And the headwind that the relative cost of the kinds of things the government buys, services, are going up. So I'd be pleased if we were able to do over time 50-50, but I think it's not going to be that easy.
Next.
Jed Schwartz. Do you have an opinion as to whether the Federal Reserve has some kind of need or mandate to make profit? Or is it supposed to be a profitable institution? And do you support the call from the various factions in Congress for an audit of the Federal Reserve?
The function of the Federal Reserve is to regulate the nation's finances effectively. Profit in any one year, its profit or its loss is a byproduct of that, and in any event is rebated to the Treasury. So I don't think the question of the profitability of the Federal Reserve should be any kind of central priority for it. If it was a priority, it would engage in all kinds of speculation where it lent money and it borrowed, lent money and bought financial assets. That's the last thing that I would want the Federal Reserve to be engaged in. The Federal Reserve is audited in many, many respects already. I think that the Federal Reserve is on a trend towards becoming more transparent. But I think it is too easy to suppose that everything should always be transparent immediately. I think back, for example, during the campaign, I think Governor Dukakis ran a transparent campaign. But when he was making a judgment about what position he was going to take on an issue, and 3 or 4 of us were discussing it with him, I think we had a better discussion because we had it in a room where there wasn't a TV camera and there weren't any reporters watching. And if you had moved to total transparency, I think that would have made it more difficult for Governor Dukakis to come to sensible decisions. And so I think one needs to think about these transparency issues issue by issue with respect to the Federal Reserve. I do think that where I agree, I have no time for the people who think we should be on the gold standard or something like that. I think that's just way misguided. I do think that if we were designing the Federal Reserve today, I'm not sure we would have it be quite as much a creature of the financial system as it is today in terms of the role of bankers in its governance of the regional Federal Reserve banks and all of that. And I think over time, that's a set of questions that should be looked at.
Larry, what about, I'm going to ask Greg the same question after you leave us. Should the Federal Reserve act now, and if so, what should it do?
Old Treasury Secretary habits die hard. As Treasury Secretary, I neither predicted nor prescribed for the Federal Reserve, and I suspect that CEA Chairman Mankiw followed a similar dictum. So I'm not going to answer the question. As you asked it with great respect, I would only say that I think that at this moment, the task of this, I'm talking in the kind of way people at the Fed do. There's a lot of ways, but there's kind of a point that's probably there if you listen carefully. I think that monetary policy always involves a balance, a balancing of the risks on the one hand of creating inflation, which is disruptive in various ways and then needs to be combated, and on the other hand, allowing more economic slack, more unemployment, more unused capacity to persist. And you're always trying to balance those two risks. And you're sometimes walking along a quite narrow ledge where you could fall off on either side. In my judgment in the United States today, the risks on the side of persistent stagnation are significantly greater than the risks are of an acceleration of inflation. And I think that has obvious implications for the direction of monetary policy. I think if it were possible for the Federal Reserve to just lower the interest rate, if the interest rate right now were 2%, I'm I'm sure I'd be for reducing it to 1.5%. Problem is, you can't reduce it below, essentially can't reduce it below its current level. And so the options you have are a variety of other kinds of options that involve purchasing assets that come with a variety of complexities and possible costs. And that makes it a very complicated decision that the Fed faces.
The answer is yes, I guess. One last question, and then we gotta let him go.
Here, let a couple, Mike,
Yeah.
let a couple people ask questions, then I'll answer them as a group.
Okay, why don't
How
we
about
do
just
this?
speak loudly? This thing's not really working. Can you stand up and speak loudly?
Just make it
Sure.
short and sweet.
My name's Justin. I work for the city of Boston. Quick question. President Clinton talked during his convention speech about the number of job openings that currently exist, but there are a lot of people that don't have the skills to fill those openings. And there's this whole theory that a lot of the economic problems are structural. I don't really buy into that because I don't think that in 2008 a bunch of people had their skills downgraded all of a sudden, but it seems to be popular in political circles because people get to talk about more popular things and say the word stimulus less, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Okay, another question quickly? Yeah, go ahead.
About the corporate tax and the offshore of corporate headquarters and the tax money that they, or the income that they make that is not getting taxed here, is there a way to address this? Is this a tragic situation, or is it just so much?
Okay.
Poverty?
Let's have one more question. Yeah.
The combination of high unemployment and large deficits and debt is not restricted to the US. It's common in many developed economies. Is anybody handling it better than others?
And you've got 3 minutes.
I'm training in structural unemployment. Look, I think, I'm not an expert on it, but my impression is that the kind of program that exists in Northeastern, where students spend time studying and also spend time in various kinds of internships and emerge much better prepared for the world of work than they do at many other places. My guess is that's going to be emulated a great deal around the country in the years ahead, because I think that we do a less good job in the United States than many other countries. I think Germany is a country that does this well, of moving people from the world of academic work to the world of economic work. And I think that's something we're going to have to deal with better in the years ahead. That said, and I love the man, but I think that what President Clinton didn't say was that while there are 3 million vacancies now, there were 5 or 6 million vacancies 5 or 6 years ago, and that it's the nature of an active labor market, that there are always people leaving and coming, and so there are always vacancies. And the fact that there are vacancies doesn't mean that there are major skills gaps. And my reading of the evidence would be that there is a big shortage of people who can do certain kinds of software programming. And there are another half dozen things about that size where you can think of shortages. But the general phenomenon is that for virtually every industry, virtually every occupation, and virtually every demographic group, unemployment is way up. And that suggests that there probably aren't pervasive shortages. Corporate profits. Look, it's a hard subject because the problem is that we don't get to make the rules globally. And if you're too punitive, the money goes elsewhere. It's a Pyrrhic victory. You get to establish your principles, but you got a great tax system, but nobody's under it. So it's a difficult subject to manage well. That said, if you look at U.S. multinational companies and you look at where their profits are, what are the foreign countries in which U.S. multinationals earn the highest profits, you might expect, to name a few examples, Japan, Germany, and China to be high up on the list. them being big economies, we have big presences and stuff. They're actually not high on the list. The places that are high on the list are places like Ireland, Luxembourg, and the Cayman Islands. And that's probably telling you something. And there's a whole area of what's known as transfer pricing, which is basically, I produce a medicine, and the way I produce the medicine is I license the patent, and I make a payment to license the patent, and then I go on. Well, which country is the patent in? Which country is the production in? Which country do the profits show up in? Let's just say people are able to do things that aren't such common sense, and they often don't get stopped. And that's something where better regulations and frankly much more staffing of the enforcement of the tax law could do a great deal. I remember we used to talk about it during Governor Dukakis' campaign, that when he became governor in 1974, he and his tax commissioner, a guy named Ira Jackson, did a set of things that, apart from changing the tax rules, substantially improved the intensity and quality of tax enforcement. And that generated some substantial extra revenue. And I think there's scope to do things like that at the federal level. Nobody's dealing with all of this particularly well. Frankly, we're dealing with it better than many. In the United States, for example, where there was a commitment to using fiscal policy, the GDP is substantially greater than it was at the beginning of this downturn 5 or 6 years ago. In Great Britain, the opposite is the case. If you look at, you can never prove these things, you can never know quite what causation is, and I don't have the graph with me, but if you do a graph of how big a fiscal expansion did countries have in 2009 and 2010, and what was their economic performance between 2009 and 2011, you find a pretty strong correlation. And so I think that's a lesson. I think, as I mentioned, that Germany's done some things well in the structural area. But there aren't a lot of vastly happy stories out there. And while I've hardly sought to minimize our problems, I will tell you that having spent a lot of time in the 20 months since I left government traveling, I would, all things considered, have the rather face the economic problems that the next President of the United States and his Secretary of the Treasury are going to face than the problems that any European country or Japan or almost any other country in the world are going to face in the economic area. So these are things that demand focus, attention, argument, and compromise, but no one should suppose that they are inside. Thank you very much.